agenda. We are not favoring any particular political party. Everything that myself and my colleagues have been saying in the recent days, our statement from last week, basically all of that is also reflected in the Constitution of Zimbabwe, on statements that we have heard from the government before, issues that have been highlighted in the Transitional Stabilization Program from last October, where there's a sector section on governance, there's references to human rights, so basically what we are referring to is, are the universal values of human rights that we have subscribed to within the UN framework, that Zimbabwe has also signed up to within the African framework with the African Union, and also that are also reflected in the Cotonou Agreement, which is then the agreement that binds Zimbabwe and the EU together as part of Zimbabwe as one of the African, Caribbean, Pacific countries. So these are our reference points. And we have voiced these concerns, obviously, in our discussions with the government. And so we have been taking these issues up, and they are well known. Indeed, the past events compelled us to come out in the open with a joint statement by the EU delegation and a number of other diplomatic missions last week, when we had serious concerns about these recent violations of human rights and civic liberties. It was all the more important for us to come out in the public, as this comes as a continuation of very, very troubled events that we have had during the past here in Zimbabwe, and in Zimbabwe's case also reflected also in the past. From an EU perspective, and when we are talking about the international community, and obviously I can't speak on the behalf of the whole international community, but just as a representative of one of the institutions and one of the partners. Obviously we want Zimbabwe to succeed. I've seen all kinds of conspiracy theories about how we have an agenda of trying to foil efforts of making Zimbabwe prosper, and all kinds of discussions about colonialism and imperialism. So obviously these kind of pointers are smoke screens for attempts to divert attention from other issues. But the question is that why on earth would we even want Zimbabwe to fail? That is the question. And we would see a prosperous Zimbabwe be an interesting partner in its own right in matters of trade and investment, but also in terms of the stability and influence that it would have in the region, in the Southern African region and the continent as a whole. So that is our hope, and that's why we are partnering with Zimbabwe. We are directing quite significant amounts of development cooperation funding to that effect, and also that's behind that's also behind our political dialogue with the government and with other stakeholders, and that's also what we are trying then to achieve when we are coming out in the public and voice our concerns. The agenda is to change behavior and change it in a way that is respectful for the principles, the values that both Europe and Zimbabwe subscribe to. One issue that is we were talking about also, I noticed that there were some discussions about the definition of crisis. Clearly there's a humanitarian crisis in Zimbabwe. Roughly a third of the population will be in need of food aid. So the economic dimension is extremely important, but it's linked to the political dimension in the approach that the international community has. politics and economy go hand in hand. And that's one of the reasons why indeed we are following quite closely the human rights situation in the country. Now from an EU perspective, there's a lot of attention to quote-unquote sanctions that we call the restrictive measures. And I see that I have to over and over again emphasize that I fail to see how they will have, what kind of an influence they would have on the economic situation of the country. They are restricted and they are the list of targeted individuals and companies that were on the list used to be much longer. These days we have 2 individuals. It's a former presidential couple. Zimbabwe Defense Industries as the only company that is targeted. And then we have an arms embargo. It's pertinent to the situation that because the reason why the restrictive measures were introduced in the first place in 2002 was related to the human rights situation and to the limitation of civic rights. And that's why, as a foreign policy instrument, that is unfortunately still topical, even though it's very limited in scope and therefore, from our point of view, doesn't have any economic effect on the country. On the contrary, the EU has a free trade agreement, quite a generous free trade agreement with Zimbabwe, the Economic Partnership Agreement. And in fact, whilst Zimbabwe has a huge trade imbalance, a big deficit in terms of imports and exports in general, in fact, it enjoys a surplus towards the EU. Zimbabwe is exporting more to the European Union than it imports. Unfortunately, it's just a fraction of the trade, it's a 5%. But it just shows, in my opinion, that these discussions about the economic effect of the restrictive measures are not well-based. Like I said, I can't speak on behalf of the wider international community. I don't have that mandate, but I just wanted to note that with all these discussions on the sanctions going on, the Transitional Stabilization Program in fact refers to ZERA. It's one of giving us one of the pointers when they're under the heading of good governance about issues to be tackled. So I've seen a big change in that discussion about how to relate to these measures that are part of the international community have taken vis-à-vis Zimbabwe. On the way forward, so we have been very much being supportive of the government reform agenda. We have been supportive of it politically and also through our development cooperation. We have directed funding to support, for example, bringing the secondary legislation in line with the Constitution. We have done this in full understanding with the government. We are operating full transparency in our development aid with different partners. The Ministry of Finance knows or should know exactly what we are doing and who we are funding. So there's no secrets behind that. So we have been supportive of this agenda. We would have been very much hoping that it would have been moving forward faster. We are seeing some movement now on the legislative agenda. We hope that there will be positive outcomes from the work that is under process, and indeed that the outcomes would be up to the spirit and the letter of the Constitution, because that's the whole idea. But at the same time, if you have constant news about human rights violations, I fail to see how it could be business as usual from a Western perspective. So it's not only about what is happening about the laws, but also how they are implemented and how they are followed. So that's quite important. There's also then the big issues about the debt that Zimbabwe has towards the international community. The European Union member states are among the biggest creditors to Zimbabwe. And it's also an agenda that we want to move forward, because we clearly want to see, Zimbabwe, normalize its relations. But these questions revolving around arrears clearance and so forth are also being linked very much to this, both the economic side of the agenda and the political side of the agenda. Because clearly in the European capitals, attention is paid to what is happening in the country and what news are coming from the country. So that's why in my own engagements I've always been saying that please give us good news, and something that we can use also toward our domestic audiences to show that Zimbabwe is on a different kind of a path. So I'm still hopeful that we will be moving on a more positive trajectory, which would then open up all kinds of opportunities. Only from the European perspective, we have the whole financing around development is moving away from the traditional grant aid towards different kind of loan and guarantee mechanism to support the private sector. And these are quite substantial. Now Zimbabwe is missing out on these, not because of any sanctions or restrictive measures, however you want to call them, but because of the arrears issue and the debt issue, which then makes it impossible for these instruments to be used. This is a very important time in EU-Zimbabwe relations, because we are starting to plan ahead for the next multi-annual financial framework of the European Union. That's the big multi-annual budgetary framework, which then covers the whole of Union's finances, and development cooperation is part of it. So we are soon entering in a phase where we are going to plan about how our cooperation will continue and what ways and means are we using with different countries. So this is a process that is starting, and what is happening in Zimbabwe is of course relevant for that process when we are thinking about our further cooperation. What is important, because it's multi-annual, is that whatever decisions we are now taking in the next approximately a year or so will then guide our cooperation for many years in the 2020s and in the future. So we are living in quite important times. So all of these issues are interlinked, and we from the international community are following quite closely what's happening in the country. When we publicly, and just to re-emphasize, when we publicly voice our concern, when we privately voice our concern, is basically in the hope that we would see a more positive trajectory in the country. Maybe I'll leave it at that as introduction. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Timo. So, before we open the floor to discussion, just 3 points. The first is the repeat of what I see as problematic for us. If we accept, as I've indicated, that we have a state in disarray, a state in decline, a fractious state, suggesting that maybe there's no one in control, and that at one level you can have fractiousness growing, warlordism possible in such a situation. And I was suggesting to Justina that it's not so much denials. I thought those denials were very lame. It was, for me, it reflected people who are not in charge, don't know what's happening. If that's the position, how do we move forward without making dialogue an industry? It becomes meaningless. Huh? Who do you talk to if you want dialogue in the state? Who is there? Even the military is visible only in the manner in which it beats out violence. But who in the military shall we talk to for those who want to engage in dialogue? So we have a problem. At the same time, we cannot stand by in the face of growing violence. How do we stop the kind of outrageous things are happening. How do we stop that? It must be stopped. How do we get everybody, the international community, all ourselves to ensure that citizens are not abducted at night, beaten up, killed? How do we stop that? That becomes urgent. The third, of course, is that this dialogue is part of a process which some of us are engaged in, and I hope that Britt Bomba says something in the course of the discussion. We are going towards the National Citizens Convention, which was postponed precisely because of the happenings, abduction. Some of our members were abducted. Mkono there was one of the victims, and we could not do what we were supposed to do end of August. So, but we are proceeding with the National Convention as part of this quest for a solution to our problems. But more important, how we can put on the ground a format, as to the nature of the dialogue and the objective of the dialogue, so that we put some, whether it's a Lancaster House type, whether it's a Sudanese type, transitional authority, whatever, something has to be done. And how do we bring the international community and the region together, even though the region is disarray? We have to continue trying to see how we can engage them. So I invite your questions, comments. We have half an hour, at the end of which my panelists will talk. Don't ask them difficult questions.
Yes,
they're not here to answer questions as to what to be done. Begin from Mkono.
Thank you.
Identify yourself.
I'm Kai Mkono.
Yes.
The youth chairperson of the Christ Zimbabwe Coalition. And I think that the fundamental question that confronts us at this moment is how do we resolve the outstanding issues emanating from the military coup of November 2017? Because what I see, and I think is generally shared, is that we now have an entrenched military elite that is determined, in my view, in commodity brokerage, eating gold, diamond, oil, and fuel. So literally, because our economy is so tiny and it's basically dependent on commodities, and most of it, what we have is basically minerals. That's why they go all out there and say. And if you look at it, the pattern is that all of these top military people and the people within the hierarchies in government, they have interests in mining, they have huge interest in the fuel industry, they have huge interest in diamonds. So when you have such kind of a scenario, for them, governance is lit, it has nothing to do with service delivery. That's why I'm telling you, we have a surplus that can't buy gloves for doctors just across the road in Parenya. They have to wait for the same sanctions countries that are imposing them through SID, EU, and GFID to fund their own hospitals and education. Because for them, it's about the last supper, what Comrade commanders were saying, that they are there to eat, to simply enjoy. It's a last supper mentality for them to say, this is the moment, let's have it, and have it all. So I think that is where we really have the fundamental problem. And when you then look at the human rights situation, I was recently arrested, I was over-detained, I went to court, hoping to get justice. The magistrate said, so the constitution was read to him, it's very clear in terms of section 50, where it says that the right of an accused person who has been detained, if you are over-detained beyond 48 hours, the court must simply release you. They don't have to listen to the charge that is at all. But there was a magistrate who said, one of the most confusing judgments I've ever in my entire life. This was what he said. He said, because of the nature of the charges of the accused, you cannot release him, even if he has been over-detained. Because of the nature of the charges, he cannot be released. He agreed. The state paper said I was arrested at 11 a.m. on Thursday. I only appeared in court at 3 p.m. on Saturday. Clearly within 4 hours of over-detention. It's written on the state paper, it's acknowledged by the state that the accused person has been over-detained. But the nature of the charges cannot allow me to release. And the charges are that I tweeted sometime in January that let's join hands to show our anger with what is happening, and either the government solves our issues or they simply resign if they fail to do so. That's the charge. But it said because of that nature of the charges, they cannot release it even after my rights have been clearly violated. And they acknowledge it. So like they're denying it. There's written on the papers that they have violated, but we are going to do that. So I think we really have to have a dialogue, and that dialogue is going to happen. It is very sincere. And the sincerity starts with, I think, Nangabo acknowledging that he's not in charge. I don't think he's in charge. I doubt that he's in charge. And that we have to go back to say, the guys, the comrades who rolled out tankers and removed the garden all celebrated. What are your interests in the spread of this country?
Yes, Titi?
Thank you. Excuse me. My name is Titi Dangarejo. I'm an artist, a writer, and a filmmaker. And I'd really like to thank people for having asked me to be, suggested to me that I become part of the platform, the Concerned Citizens platform. And I would just like to add on to some of the things that have been said here. My assessment of the situation as someone coming from outside the politics, the humanitarian aspect, is that we are actually not engaging at all the levels and in all the areas that we should be engaging in. We talk about human rights, we talk about trade, we talk about all these things, but I haven't yet heard anyone say the people. We are talking about human rights, but who are these human rights being violated upon? We look at ourselves here. This is a national, a policy dialogue forum, which would like to have national repercussions. How many are we here? Are we asking ourselves how we engage with the people? All right, we have the media, but the role of the media is to depart information. It is to be objective, it is to be balanced. Now, I would like to ask you, is information the thing that determines how a person behaves? Somebody said we have to change behavior. Are we really assuming that information, as through the media, is what changes behavior? From where I'm coming from, also as a student of psychology, I would say no. Information is one of the last things that changes behavior. Information is useful insofar as it impacts on other aspects of human being, which is emotional aspects. Now we are talking about things like fear. We are talking about things like how we are able to process information. How many of you have had the situation that you're in an examination and you know that you've read, but because you're so nervous, you cannot process the information? Now these are things that have been going on in this country, and we know about it. We had the national, what was it called, the Organ for National Healing and Reconciliation, and they were talking about these kinds of emotional, subjective impacts on people that have been going on for decades. And yet when we meet like this, we don't talk about them. The international community does not talk about them. The international community operating in Zimbabwe now does engage with artists, but which artists are they engaging with? Are they engaging with artists who can contribute to engaging with this symbolic level of where we live? Because you can give as much information as you want. You can have as many meetings here as you want. But if you are not able to talk to people at a level that speaks to them in their context, they are not going to change anything. And I also think we are having the same problem when we look at the government. We are saying, oh, it's a government in disarray. I beg to differ. It's not a government in disarray. It's a government that knows exactly what it wants. And it's doing exactly what it wants in order to get what it wants. And in order to do that, it has to keep us, the people, in certain situations of confusion, of unhappiness, of inability to do anything but manage to put food on the table today. Because it knows that if we have better conditions, we will be able to do more. So I beg to differ, and I think that we have to have different ways scenarios at which we look at our government and say, okay, it could be this. If it is this, then what do we do? It could be that. If it is that, then what do we do? But I feel that the whole thing that we are missing here is actually what makes humans act. And what makes humans act is what they want. So,
thank you, Titi. I'll come back to you. I'll ask Michael.
Thanks, people, for inviting me here, and thanks to Kenneth, Justina, and Timo for the very helpful remarks that you made. Like Timo, you said, my name is Michael Atingebo. I work for the Macroeconomic and Financial Management Institute here in Harare. I'm not Zimbabwean. So like Timo said, I'm not competent to comment on what Kenneth and Justina said. So I'll just talk about economics and my understanding of how it works at the international level, and trying to relate it to Zimbabwe to answer the question that we're trying to address. I came to Zimbabwe in September last year. From where I was coming, I was in Washington. And so come October, there was a monetary policy statement which distinguished between FCA and the USD, an acknowledgement that really the two were not equal, right? And then it was confirmed in, I think it was February, you're right? Where the interbank market in FX was introduced, really to, and the governor said it's 2.5 to 1. So that was the issue. Now we've seen it slide to about 10, right? To 10 RTGs to $1 US. So that is begging a question for me. The question is, the Minister of Finance has been saying that they are running a surplus budget and what have you. So what has been going through my mind based on my experiences, then what has driven the exchange rates from 2.5 at the time it was announced to 10? There must be something not correct here. So really, if there is a fiscal surplus that the minister is talking about, then there's something else driving the exchange rate. And this is what I've been trying to ask myself. Is it a confidence factor? Is it politics? I'm not sure. So I look at the reform that the government has undertaken. It is very obvious that there was a lot of rent seeking, at least in February. There was a lot of rent seeking by the time the government announced the 2.5 exchange rate. Because at 1-to-1, the parallel market rate was anywhere around 3. So it means that those who had good connections and were getting $1 at 1-to-1 were making hefty profits by selling at 3. That is rent seeking. And if you look at the price of fuel, right, whereas in the region, fuel is likely priced at more than $1 USD per liter. If you had to use the parallel rate to convert the real price of fuel here, it was a few cents. So no matter how much money the government allocated for the importation of fuel, you never have enough fuel here, because it is likely that it was pilfering through, I don't know, but in economics, when there's a profit to be made, people will do everything to see how to earn that profit. So now let's look at where we're today. Today, we have seen fuel is coming close to $1 per liter. And maybe the incentive to smuggle or to trade is being limited. Even those, the rent seeking, those who are well connected, maybe are not making as much as they are making. So maybe there you reduce on the rent seeking behavior to some extent. But the fundamental question is, with all these reforms, a depreciated exchange rate, what are the social costs of this adjustment? How is it affecting the people? So I want to divide people into 3 categories. They're the well-to-do, they're the urban poor, and they're the rural poor. And I'm asking myself, who is the most hit among these 3 categories of people? Well, the well-to-do, maybe the top 5%, maybe are cushioning themselves through other ways and means. The rural poor are still subsisting, so maybe the impact is not as much as the urban poor. So my concern with the current reforms are that, whereas the reforms have been taken, the social cost, the what I would call the social safety nets to deal with the social cost of adjustments are not very clear. What is government doing about the people who are being impacted? Look at the rural poor, all right? The taxi fares have gone up, the food prices have gone up, the rent has gone up, the income has stayed the same. How are you questioning these guys, right? That to me is breeding really sort of anger and wrath. And these are guys who can be exploited, right, by anybody. So I think we need to put in place social safety nets to deal with the social cost of adjustments that is being faced right now. Then secondly, the issue of re-engagement. As long as we don't have fresh external financing, no matter what reforms we are going to undertake here, I think the government needs to focus more effort on how can we re-engage, how can we deal with the areas, the World Bank to ADB to EIB and the Tripartite Club, because we need to get back some fresh financing to support the reform that we are undertaking. So in the absence of that, it is very difficult. So government should look at what needs to be done. And finally, I know Zimbabwe is open for business, but we also need to look at what is the cost of doing business in Zimbabwe so that the foreign investors come. So these are the issues to me that needs to be tackled. I thank you, Ivo.
Thanks, Michael. In the corner then.
My name is Tinashe Muzambi. I wanted to talk about the civil society. I wanted to talk about the role of civil society. Looking at what is happening, the current abductions and other human rights issues. I think one thing that I have noted is the issue of I think lack of coordination or the linkage between the civic society and the opposition. Because if you look at the reports that come out after abductions, you find that there's disconnection between the civic society, which has to play a very pivotal role on human rights issues, and at the same time the opposition. It looks like there's no coordination, there's no linkage. So when such issues are being raised, it becomes very difficult to come up with the specific issues or solutions. And I noted that I think he was talking about this rate of how the state is right now. Even in the opposition and the civil society, it looks like there's also it's scattered. There's no real coordination in terms of human rights issues.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Identify yourself, please.
My name is Abigail Mpambi. I'm a human rights defender, pro-democracy activist from the Civil Society and Czech History Forum. I'll quickly also get into you said there is no coordination between opposition and civil society. Do you understand that civic society is a constituent of its own and the opposition a constituent of its own? I don't see anything wrong much on that. Let me probably visit the issue of the, you drew us to a point, say, where you said part of the crisis emanated from the 2017 coup, where we all made probably a blunder, endorsed even by the opposition. And I want to believe that the 2018 elections, to some extent, was an opportunity to deal with that issue, as it seeks closure to such. And we started a new chapter. I want to move faster and draw to the issue that I think the ghost that is haunting our country, the legitimacy, illegitimacy question. How real is that issue? Because from my understanding is that legitimacy can never be drawn, not even from the international community, not even from any other either position papers or any kind of mobilization, but want to sober up and say, we must draw legitimacy from the Constitution. Yes, there are issues of dispute. But do you remember that 2013, we all moved around the country and agreed to the Constitution, where in that very same Constitution, the opposition had 2 representatives and one from ZANU-PF. And we said this is the new constitution that unfortunately is remaining new also. But the issue is, we agreed and said this is the constitution that we must then listen to, not part of it. The human rights issues we are speaking about is the Bill of Rights from the constitution. And the very courts who then gave us the unpopular outcome out of the 2018 elections, they exist in terms of the very same constitution. So are we saying we will take part of the constitution and make it an agenda? The other one, we say, no, this one, we cannot do it. What am I drawing to? I am saying, at the moment, we need, in particular, appeal with the opposition to say, are we going with this constitution or we are saying, let's start afresh? What are you saying? Because for now, we are guided with the constitution. I want to believe the constitution gave us closure to this so that we cannot continue to campaign forever. Let's find each other as a country and say, how can we then go forward? When there are parts of the constitution we don't agree with, maybe let's revisit, because we have our parliamentarians in parliament. Let's lobby for such amendments and take the country forward. Thank you.
So I'm trying to grant a discussion. What is to be done? There is a suggestion. The issue of legitimacy. Some of us have suggested that on the part of MDC, Shamisa, it's a bit useless to keep insisting that Emerson is illegitimate. That may be so, but he is recognized in the region. Okay? So maybe the idea of the dialogue should begin by each side making concessions. Emerson's not insisting that he won the election when he didn't win the election, but agreeing that there's a dispute, but therefore I should go to the table to discuss. Shamisa should stop insisting that he won the election and that it should be in State House. He should also agree that in the circumstances it's better to go for a transition arrangement until the next election, during which the issues are raising. That's one. The second point I want to raise, the one raised by Michael. How do you break the vicious cycle, Timo? We know without an injection of funds into the country, there is nowhere we're going. But in the same vein, there can be no injection of funds until there's reform. And we have just said this government is incapable of reform. It was Jonathan Moyo in his earlier life who said, we can't allow ourselves to reform ourselves out of power. That is exactly the position. So how do we break this deadlock? Let's try and address those two questions. Tsitsi, again, can I take someone else? Yes?
I am Taurai Andika, freelance journalist. I only have 2 questions. The first is directed to Ms. Justina Mpoku on what needs to be done. She has by all means proven that abductions are real and they actually took place, that Gonyet was abducted. Don't you think it's necessary to approach and assist police with information? Seems like you know very well that abductions happened and maybe give the information. After you give police that information, their leads, if they fail to arrest, then there is a case now, because the moment people are coming to report your organization, do not have arresting powers. How does that help in ending this so-called abduction? My other question is directed at Dr. Iboman. When you were he was introducing Mr. Timo, he said, my friend, when he was giving an opportunity to Mr. Michael, also said, my friend. So I want to know what needs to be done now is to understand the reasons why we do these discussions. Is it to plan an agenda, or is to make way forward, or is to sustain this trust so that it keeps on getting some funds here and there to keep on moving? If they are friends, are they your friends personal friends that usually meet outside this platform, plant agenda to them, or you say friends just to convince us that
I don't answer the first question about the police. You remember that in the last abductions, the police themselves were quite astonished. They didn't know what to do. They're helpless in the face of these abductions, and that's the first thing. It speaks to the fractiousness within the state, the division within the state. The second, yes, it's true. Timo and Michael are my friends, very good friends. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Tatina Mandongo. I'm the spokesperson for the Zimbabwe National Students Union in ASO. Firstly, if you look at what is the problem, there's been talk of Emerson Mnangagwa and Nelson Chamisa. And indeed, like I've always pushed the narrative that here in Zimbabwe, we have a leadership crisis, not just in Zimbabwe, but also on the opposition side. Because with two men flaunting their egos, what the nation suffers. And especially as a youthful activist, I speak on behalf of the youth. Now we have what we call a generational genocide, in terms of the fact that now the youth are unemployed, they're engaging in drugs, and people no longer have any future to look up to. So technically, this is now a case whereby we should question what answers we need should be looked into the citizens. This is no longer an MDC ploy. This is no longer BSNOP ploy. Because both this cabal has shown that their intent is either on grabbing and looting or on getting power. Like I've once said, that you cannot say Zimbabwe is open for business once you're shutting down business by abducting people, by rolling over lawlessness in the nation. And you cannot keep on saying you need a JHA when you know that you need a JHA. There are people who are suffering. And as I was sitting down, I was looking through an image on a WhatsApp message of two birds talking. One was in a cage, the other one was out. And it was a crow and a parrot. The crow was asking the parrot, why are you in a cage? And the parrot responded, because I speak. Now it's an issue where we have people who speak, they are trying to be muzzled. And those who do not speak, they are being pushed to the forefront. We have, like I said, with the leadership vacuum, we have a group of war veterans who was, I believe the association is mainly headed by men who suffer from logoria. Incoherent speech, they just speak out of nowhere. They don't have any credible information to give to the nation. So at this point, as the youth, I think we should take the initiative, proper dialogue, push this people to the forefront. That's why even if you see Killer Zifu was suspended for suggesting that Nelson Chamisa's wife and his wife should bring together their husband. The problem we have in Zimbabwe is that we push aside people who talk sense, and we accept nonsense. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. My name is Makombo, and as a citizen, my concern, what I see citizens here, but also citizens, they maybe service representatives. It's not like representative political parties. When they are ruling opposition, or those opposing to opposition. But my concern is citizens. It's where I'm coming from. Transport is unaffordable. There's load shedding. It's actually very dangerous for me to even go home right now because in the dark you can get robbed. And transport is unaffordable. You don't know the price that you used to get into town. It's different from the one that you used to get back home. You try to go to the super buses. You pickpocketing everything, you lose everything. There's high unemployment. Those are the issues that affect me as a citizen. Unemployment, debt industries, there's no hope. You try to maybe even speak out. You get arrested, given charges of trying to subvert. You speak up against corruption, against poverty, but you're accused of trying to subvert the whole government. I was saying our government is corruption. I was saying we are being governed by corruption or by harm. That is the critical question as a citizen, and the citizens that we should come to. Because what I feel is there has been a political impasse. Coup, individually, post-coup, then elections, and post-elections period. But now the era and the trend we are in, we acknowledge, and I'm sure that political parties, they may be even platforms where they discuss this issue, legitimacy or illegitimacy. But as citizens, we should also have issues or platforms like this one, where we discuss about our problems, issues that are affecting us, and also provide solutions. What we proffer the solutions that we have over billions disappearing in command agriculture. We have billions which are disappearing in diamond. We have billions more disappearing in NASA. We have more money disappearing every day. We have now collecting our toll fees, but our roads every day the potholes are turning into pitfalls. So as citizens now, what do we really need? We have, because my question is going towards asking what kind of solution do we need? Because where there are platforms like, the Pollard, but as a citizen, I was not a presidential candidate government. And some of the people who are there are not even affected by the issues that are affecting me for unemployment. Maybe they already employed, maybe Pollard is a form of employment because of the issues that they have people. So if we are to have a dialogue, should this still remain just a dialogue, or people will simply contest it? So that I'm asking this so that as a citizen, I know if next election I will also contest for me to have my voice known or recognized by the government of the day, whether it wins or loses again. So the question now is, when it comes to solutions, I think now there should be a special type of consideration where we bring various special groups with special interests. We have the workers, they have problems. In January, they were persecuted. Their members during the stairway, they were maimed, abducted, some were murdered, some were raped. We have, right now, as we are speaking, we have citizens from various groups, students, women groups, vendors, they are being persecuted. So if you are to have a dialogue, or to have a solution, it should include all these interests. Not just the legitimate question. The legitimate question, yes, is there and it should be addressed, but it should never at any point, overcome or overshadow the problem that we are speaking of. Yes, it's a critical issue, it's a critical part of the equation to solutions, but we should also have the critical voices of other citizens. Various, from the civil society especially, because in the trade union, student movements, social movements, because where we are not only just focusing on the legitimate question, because there are no more issues contained, but there are real questions contained. There are real issues of, if we are, even some of us got to go back home right now, we are not even comfortable sitting at our homes. Well, maybe I even contributing can receive a midnight visit, which we have a visit, not visit, depending on whose agenda it is or who is articulating it. But I'm sure, I think it's a serious reminder to all of us here on how we respond to issues of abductions. When dead Zamara went missing, most of the people spent months disputing, saying, he's in South Africa, he's in Botswana, no, they are lying, it's a plot. But look, it's years now. He's yet to be seen. Is it still a plot? What does it take for people to really acknowledge that there's been an abduction? What does it really take for people to acknowledge that there's been a rights violation? What does it take? We see even people, injured, who have been tortured. We see even
let's stop there for a while.
Saying that it's a skit. But I think we really need to take this issue seriously and also have a solution kind of mindset towards the problems that we have. Because they are real, we are all suffering and we all need solution. And what brought us over here is about solution. So we really need to work towards solutions and inclusive solutions, which bring everyone on board. Because if the solution is if someone there, the government, it's not a solution.
Thanks. I take the last three. Short, Linda, Sitsi, and yourself, and Tony. Last. No, Linda said.
Thank you very much. I won't talk much, but I just wanted to start by highlighting this issue of legitimacy and illegitimacy. I think it is still taking the nation backwards. In March last year, I personally took the current president of Zimbabwe to the Constitutional Court to challenge the legitimacy issues. Nelson Chamisa and company refused to be part of that challenge because the So at the end of the day, the moment we're supposed to challenge legitimacy of the so-called junta government or whatever we want to call them today, the main opposition party was not interested. Maybe because they had side deals that they had done with them. So we cannot continue crying foul, yet they went into an election, we all went into an election knowing that ZANU-PF was not going to let go of power after getting power in whatever way they got it in November 2017. Almost everyone in this room participated in those marches and everything else. And now today, fast forward, we want to cry about legitimacy and illegitimacy issues. We have to stop these power struggles, power fights and everything else. Because those people who are leading Zimbabwe to fight against each other are sitting pretty in the houses in Glenlaw, in Amsterdam and everything else. And I'm calling upon civic society today to stop taking sides of political parties and to start standing up and representing the people of Zimbabwe. The people of Zimbabwe have suffered enough. And politicians have been manipulating their poverty. They have been manipulating their helplessness so that they continue having their support. The people of Zimbabwe need proper education on their constitutional rights, which they are not aware of. They're just told to go and sit in the street. Sitting in the street is a crime on its own. As in 2016, I was actually taken to prison for obstruction of traffic and everything else. So when political parties are not educating their members that what they are doing is illegal, and when they get arrested, they say it's abuse of human rights. I think we are missing it somewhere. We have to be factual about real things. Political leaders have to teach their members to do the right things, legal things, and stop crying for every time. Civic society has to stand for every Zimbabwean citizen and be able to educate them on their fundamental human rights. Because it is folly. We are always here. Thank you very much, Mr. Mandaza, for providing this platform. But this platform has to go down to the grassroots, to the high density areas, to rural areas, so that people start getting an appreciation of their rights. We will find that almost every time we have these conversations, it's the same crowd, same people, and the only people who are managing to watch this on live stream are people in the diaspora, because data is too expensive. How is this information that we are sharing in this room going down to the grassroots? Do they have an appreciation of things that are going on in this country and what needs to be done? And lastly, I just want to ask Reverend Mutata, through ZCC, they've been doing well in trying to have this conversation with political leaders, the dialogues and everything, to be able to go to the military leadership and say it's time you engage with the Zimbabweans, understand what they want and where they want to go. Because honestly, a person with a knife cannot fight with a person with a gun. We have to dialogue for us to be able to understand that there is no one who is more Zimbabwean than the other. We are all Zimbabweans, and we have to converge and meet at that center post where we are saying this is the direction that we want to take as Zimbabweans. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And then Titi, and then Tony last.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Ebo Mandaza. I would want to call you comrade because I hear you were being politicized already. So I wouldn't want to call you that, but I'll call you from the academic titles that you have, which I envy, and I hope that one day I'll read them. I've decided to write my questions down so that I do not take a lot of time. I've seen others going for 20 minutes, 1 hour. I'll try to restrict it for 5 minutes or lesser. I'm used to the discourses from the other two presenters, except that today I have a rare opportunity to talk with the ambassador from the European Union, and it is only him that I'm going to direct my question. So welcome, Mr. Ambassador. In fact, His Excellency, and it's my opportunity to talk to you. Firstly, I want to ask you this question, in fact, His Excellency, Mr. Tim Okonendi. You come from Europe and you are the chief diplomat of all countries in the European Union. You saw what happened to France with regards to the Yellow Vest protest, and I'm sure you are pretty aware of the processes that unfolded there. And the heavy-handedness which the French government responded to those peaceful, or I would say relatively peaceful, protesters as compared to what we saw in January in Zimbabwe, which protests were surrounded with massive looting, violence, and as well as the August 1 shootings, which were also characterized with an attempt to assault, to set the ruling party headquarters, where I was anyway, in fire after a subordinate headquarters in another province had been set on fire. Can you do a comparative analysis between the two? And honestly, are you convinced as the European Union ambassador that what France did was right in the circumstances involved, but what our government did maybe let me just say on the 16th of August, from which your statement came from, was completely bad. Let's analyze the two, and I'm sure in the two instances, only battlesticks were used, except that in France they were have. Let me also come to, the statement that you issued, His Excellency. Don't you think you talked about the fear of being misconstrued as a person who is delving so much into the internal affairs of a sovereign? I would want to say maybe you expressed that fear knowing full well that you have done that. I'm sorry, Mr. President, but here is what I just want to take you through. Do you think you are the only ambassador or diplomat seconded to this republic from Zimbabwe to Limpopo? Of course, certainly not. How many ambassadors or diplomatic missions we have from Africa who are closer and brothers and sisters more than perhaps you are, given the acrimonious relationship that surrounds colonization? Now, my question to you is, do you think all others that have not been quiet and have restricted themselves to the established decorum of diplomatic missions are fools or don't love us so much than you do? At the same time, you speak glowingly of restrictive measures against us. They have not instituted, and they are trying to help us to help ourselves. You are not doing that. In fact, you are proud of the restrictive measures that you are talking about. Do you think you are not doing much? Then thirdly, you know what the instance that, we talk these things, Dr. Ibomadas, I'm sorry, but I'm trying to be as civil as I should be, as a reflection of the reforms that are also happening. Now, I would say, you saw the American diplomatic servicemen and women in the house of an opposition senior leader. And, I don't know whether you've been in Tunisia, maybe you have also had the privilege to be there under the cover of darkness. Now, there is so much that happens in those outskirts of the town. Assuming a committee of members could have ramped into that room and something very bad could have happened to the diplomatic servicemen and women from the United States of America, which is bullying us and also being part of this strategy to organize against our government, which you also know very well, and what we only saw in those pictures were V11 forms, and here we mean evidence when we talk about V11. What do you think could have happened to our government in terms of having to take responsibility for those errant diplomatic servicemen and women? I don't want you to speak on behalf of America, that is why I've not even spoken much about Zidera, but I want you to tell me, particularly me, and then perhaps for the benefit of others, on what that means in the conduct of diplomatic missions. And then finally, let me just say finally, though, and I'll not go far. You talk so much about the existence of the right to demonstration, which has become so topical in this our generation. Do you think the right to demonstrate and protest exists completely ignorant of the institutions of the state and that are part of our constitutional democracy, which are supposed to guarantee those rights? I talk of the courts. I also talk of the policing institution, that is the regulating structures from the security architecture of the country. Assuming that a court has taken a decision that certain demonstrations should not take place for 1, 2, 3, 4 reasons, and then some people say, no, we will proceed, but it is a court ruling. What kind of a democracy exists specifically and exclusively for liberties without ensuring a workable nexus between those liberties and institutions of the state that are guaranteed to protect them? I'm saying this in conclusion, in one sentence. I'm saying this, Mr. Ambassador, because just for the benefit of you in particular, and I'm not warning you, please, that's why I'm trying to put my smile very well. The reason why we had acrimonious relations between the white race in this country and the black race in this country, of course, more from a political party, at around the early 2000s, which resulted in those water pictures that you would want to take a second look on. It was because of what I would call diplomatic activism from diplomatic missions from hostile countries, by way of some of those statements and by way of also that errant behavior where they are found hatching a plan against government in those houses. So I'm saying, don't you think what is happening currently, or what has started happening, may be setting a dangerous course against that could possibly provoke the recurrence of such a situation again? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't think those were questions, but more your own statement of.
I'm waiting for them to listen if they would like to. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. I just think I want to repeat again, building on what Linda has said and what Makomorero has said, is that what we need is a consolidated, non-political approach to what is happening. Because any political approach is going to be moving in the same circles as the political dispensation that has created the problem. So we need to have some kind of non-political way of engaging with the problems. I repeat again, it is all very well for us to laugh at people and say they don't know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. What they are doing is demoralizing the population in order to exploit the population, in my opinion. That's what I see. So if you want to go to work in favor of the population, we have to start from there. And we have to work outside that whole political nexus, because the opposition, wonderful as it may be, has not delivered for us. Elections have not delivered for us. We have to think outside the box. I am talking to people who are discussing non-party elections. You know, and I say, look, this is a good idea. Let's have a paper about this. Then they come back to me and they say, oh, but I've been talking to someone, we can't do that, we don't have a backer. You know, these are things that the churches can spearhead this. Also, we need education in the population. The population knows nothing. There are ex-combatants who are late now who told me, Tsitsi, the system is stacked. We all know this, so why don't we talk about it? War veterans are there as a reserve army. People think that the president is the big chief who gives them land. They know no better. And I don't see that we are engaging with them. With all due respect for humanitarian assistance, I would say that humanitarian assistance, when it is only humanitarian assistance, is actually supporting. Because that humanitarian assistance goes through the government, so a government induces poverty so that the people have to rely on them. The rest of the world gives the government mealy and whatever to give to the people. So we have to get out of this spiral. And I really would like to ask the gentleman from the EU there that I think you have to rethink also the way you are engaging here, because it hasn't happened. You mentioned 2002 sanctions. We are now in 2019 and the situation is worse. You know, I don't know what you have to think about there, but obviously it hasn't worked. I always ask people from Europe, do you do the same thing in your own country? Do you have programs for 17 years that do not work in your own country without sitting down and saying, what do we need to do differently? But the main thing is up to us. We have to work outside the political agenda in order to influence the political situation.
Okay. Tony?
Might really get some clarification. As I understand, the conflict between Zimbabwe and the European Union was based on the Cotonou Agreement. And an article that says development assistance is based on the country which we voluntarily signed up to of good governance, rule of law, and human rights. And then the judgment was made by the European Union in 2002 that that did not apply in Zimbabwe. Then a process began of negotiation, apparent negotiation, about how to resolve that problem. My understanding is, and to put it bluntly, the Zimbabwean government basically gave the EU the middle digit. Right? They didn't talk to you, they just ignored you, and every time you had tried to have the discussions, no discussions happened. And none of those discussions happened pretty much until the coup. But in the meantime, Zimbabwe, very unusually, because I looked at this in some detail, was treated in exemplary fashion compared to other countries that fail under Cotonou. A lot of countries that fail under Cotonou just get booted out. You try the Article 92 conversation, and if that doesn't happen, Cotonou's over and you're out of Cotonou and you never get any money. So Zimbabwe actually got treated with a very soft touch. Not only did EU aid increase, new agreements were signed to allow exports to happen. So I'm very curious about this somewhat kid gloves approach with Zimbabwe. And that's one aspect that I'd like some clarification. The second one is that one of the problems that Zimbabwe has internationally is that we reach crisis points, and when you reach the crisis point, people back off. And in November 2017 was a classic crisis point. It was the distinction between a military-assisted transition, which was basically chasing the bums on the seat in an internal party matter, or that the military intervened directly in civilian affairs in violation of the constitution. Now those coups generally produce a very robust international reaction. And that reaction might well have produced the crisis that Kenneth was talking about how we resolved it. Somehow we fudged that. So you don't call it a coup in Zimbabwe, you treat us with a soft hand, and now we're in this mess, and you're being attacked, I think probably very unfairly. So, you know, it's clarification about the soft touch, where we clearly are in violation of the Cotonou Agreement and refuse to talk to you in any substantial way. And then when there is a very serious crisis, where you can pull everybody out and bring us to the negotiating table, we don't.
Thank you. Okay. We'll get our sum up from, don't have to answer any question. If we don't have to.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivo, and very lively discussion. And I was humbled by many of the comments, particularly on the internal situation here in the country. And I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to learn every day about what's the situation and how people experience the situation. For a while I was thinking that, oh good, I'm not getting any questions, but then I got quite a few. So I'm trying to respond to those. Starting with the Yellow West, yes, some people might know that I try to be active in the social media, and there's a lot of these Yellow West questions coming to my way. Now there's a word for this, it's called whataboutism. What about, this is happening in this country, what about that, then asking the question. I'm not here to defend of what's happening in France, but just to be curious, I was looking up, what's happening there, and people have gotten hurt, and originally, a couple, in the beginning, it was about basically people getting hurt by traffic when they were out on the streets. Then later on, because they were hit by tear gas canisters, there was these kind of events. But it's not. I'm the European Union ambassador in Zimbabwe. I'm not the European Union ambassador to France. So I'm not there really. I can't answer on France's behalf. What I can say that these events that have been happening in France have generated quite a lot of discussion in the European Parliament and elsewhere. And they have raised these questions about proportionate response. What is proportionate? And that's basically a very topical question here as well. What is the proportionate response in a given situation? Now, our thinking has been, how we have seen, based on the evidence that we have, is that the responses have not been proportionate in various circumstances in January and now even now recently. And that has also been one of the triggers why we have voiced our concerns. On diplomatic decorum and our behavior and how we act, and me and perhaps some of my colleagues, and then some other colleagues don't. I do apologize if we have seemed to be disrespectful. That's far from how we would want to appear. We start from a point of mutual respect, but we also believe in being frank and honest. Now, the reason why we have come out is that we have a constituency back home. I'm representing the European Union as an institution, and indirectly the taxpayers, who share a number of values, who are also investing through development cooperation, through their taxpayers' money. I have responsibilities towards my own constituency also to stand up and voice the concerns that we have. I'm driving the interests of the European Union, and upholding our common values are some of those interests. Maybe not all of my colleagues, they might not have the same necessity to come out and speak, but I can't speak on their behalf. Our US colleagues, and pictures and stories, like I've repeated already in the media that it's like these kind of conspiracy theories that is happening, and how our diplomats are fueling unrest. And so I have said we have discussed those within our community, and I don't believe in them. Pictures about meeting opposition representatives. We have heard from the government when we have been discussing that we are at liberty of interacting with various actors, throughout the society. It's part of our work. So if some of the colleagues are seen discussing with some people, I don't find that necessarily surprising. It's part of the diplomatic work. Right to demonstrate, is it that there's limitations and so forth? Of course. There's a question about demonstrations and the responsibilities of that demonstrators also have. We have always condemned vandalism and violence wherever whoever the perpetrator might be. But there's a difference here of looking at what is about security forces being also there to guarantee people's rights and not only to restrict them. It's a question about approach. So if a demonstration is going to be held, it's also a question about the security forces making sure that also the demonstrators would be their rights would be upheld, and they could exercise this right which belongs to them in terms of freedom of assembly. I won't have the time to go into details on those things. Then about rethinking our approach and the restrictive measures, how they are. They are a foreign policy tool. They are not restrictions on Zimbabwe, they are restrictions on European actors. And this is where we are coming from. When people say that these are illegal, we have a bunch of lawyers in Brussels who said who are designing these instruments, and particularly making sure that they are not contravening international law, because they are restrictions on European operators. A European company can't sell arms in Zimbabwe, but it's not a restriction on any Zimbabwean operator. A European company can't cooperate with the Zimbabwe defense industries, but it's not a restriction on anybody else doing that, or whatever happening in Zimbabwe. And then again, the question about measures on individuals. We're talking about issues such as asset freeze and travel ban. It's if you own a restaurant, I think you are also at liberty of saying who can come into your restaurant. So it's an issue about so it's the Europeans putting limitations on themselves with these restrictive measures. Efficient or not, there's various opinions about this, and people, I hear arguments going both ways on these. But ultimately, the fate of those kind of measures are then decided on the basis of what is happening in the country. They have been relaxed substantially since 2010, and this leads me to the next question about have we handled Zimbabwe with kid gloves? Indeed, for a while in the 2000s, we had what we call the appropriate measures, which were basically a freezing of development cooperation. That was then discontinued, and from 2014 onwards we have what we are calling as National Indicative Program, where we are supporting then Zimbabwe through development cooperation. Obviously I wasn't here those days, but a part of that is that yes, we are cooperating with the government, we are partnering with the government, but we are thinking about what is good for Zimbabwe as a whole and for its people. So the sectors that we then from 2014 onwards have been cooperating in are governance, health and agriculture, and for various reasons. Governance, because we have wanted to support the reform agenda. Health, because there's certainly need, and unfortunately still is, to support the health sector. And agriculture, because we see that as a potential engine of growth for Zimbabwe, and so that's why we have been designing. So it was, the motivation has been, really to support Zimbabwe to move forward. Now, so whether that is an indication of softness, it might be interpreted that way, but I think it was very much an interest of engaging with the country, and that's why I was referring to the next multi-annual financial framework, because now we will start the process of thinking what we'll do next, what will be the European Union be doing in, basically, with all the countries in the world, and Zimbabwe being one of those. There was one, the earlier one about the emotional dimension and artists, and I regret to say that we would, I would hope to have much more resources to engage with the cultural scene and arts in Zimbabwe, which I see are very interesting. I've seen various art forms that make you cry, make you laugh in this country, and I would hope that we would have more, could engage with more of that, but then there's significant restrictions on finances of how we can engage. We have some support, but not very much. But I do recognize, and that's a bit of a difficult angle to tackle from a diplomatic point of view, this emotional one, because we try to detach from the emotions and try to be as rational, but obviously we are all human beings. And then finally, one more point that I wanted to reflect upon, was this issue about social sector support, the economic situation, needing an influx of money into the country, and at the same time, if there's no reforms, then that money would not necessarily be forthcoming. In Zimbabwe, you can perceive this as a catch-22. If you don't get funding from the outside, the economy will not take off. But then on the other hand, those creditors would not probably be very lenient, in this, if there's no reforms taken ahead of that, and that then will take time. This might appear like a catch-22 in Zimbabwe, and but then the further you go, and when you go then to discuss these issues in those fora that are decisive, the multilateral financial institutions and the Paris Club of Creditors, they are looking at the question of like, okay, Zimbabwe is looking for debt forgiveness, debt restructuring. The question is why? Why should we be there? Why should we support? What is it happening? Why should we do that? And we really need to have very good arguments to respond to that, and that's why the reform agenda is so crucial in that respect, to move there. And quite honestly, when then you have news such as like the Auditor General's report about earlier use about public finances, that's not very helpful either in those discussions. So it is an issue. The IMF recognizes that's an issue, that you need social cushioning, and we are trying to see what we can do in terms of development cooperation to help that. We have gone forward with humanitarian aid, just like some other Western countries have done the same. But in terms of the overall debt issues, I believe firmly that it's very strongly linked to the reform agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all the contributions that we have listened to. I think I would want to speak first about a question or a comment that came up about the police and how we should be going to the police and giving them evidence. The people who have been affected have made reports to the police, and we expect the police to be investigating those issues fully. And I think as the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, we will continue to do our work in the corner of victims so that we are able to assist them in the best way we can. And we don't intend to be meddling in the mandate of the police, because our mandate and the mandate of the police is very different. And yes, I would also want to say that it is important that in terms of platforms are also created at the local level. They might be in their infancy, but there is work that is happening in some parts of the country. Obviously, it's not easy to be able to cover the length and breadth of Zimbabwe at the same time. So I think we are taking key steps in terms of us being able to talk to the people who matter, people who are affected more about the crisis that we are talking about. And then the issue of constitutional awareness is also an issue that we are seized with. But obviously it's something that is not going to end overnight. I think you recognize that we have 16 languages that are recognized in the Constitution. And it's also about us being able to have all those languages for those people to also follow in terms of the dialogue that's supposed to be happening. So I do appreciate that really the conversations need to go to the lower level. And it's work that we have started slowly to get to some parts of the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the conversation. I think what I can say maybe in my concluding remarks is that we have made a very clear proposal, especially from the church, that the nature of the national crisis and challenges that we face require a broad-based and a comprehensive national dialogue. We have also, I think this is in agreement across the political divide, that this is not meant to replace the conversation that is happening among politicians at the Poland. But what we are looking for is how do we structure a conversation that involves all Zimbabweans and that will resolve the challenges that face Zimbabwe. We are also convinced that we have missed opportunities for this, for the way we have resolved conflict situations in the past. After the Lancaster House Agreement, for example, which was an elite arrangement, we did not have a broad-based national conversation on how we reimagined the nation. And some few years after that, of course, we saw thousands of people being killed in Midlands and Matabeleland. In 1987, when there was an agreement to stop the violence, again it was an elite agreement of the government, the Unity Accord. But after that, we did not have a broad-based national conversation to say how do we close the chapter of the past and reimagine the future together. And of course, what we had in the Government of National Unity in 2009 allowed us to also stop the violence that had emerged around the decade of violence. But after that, we never had a serious national conversation on how we wanted to reimagine the future together. And of course, in 2017, we also did not manage to do the same. The question is whether we are going to find a solution to give closure to the current crisis and not have that meaningful conversation. And we are saying we should not. This will be a missed opportunity. If we do not take this crisis as an opportunity for us to have very serious and deep engagement on what has bedeviled this nation in the more than 40 years ago, I think we will have lost a big opportunity. Just to conclude, I would say that we, in our evaluation, we think that there are three issues that we will need to address with this conversation. First is how do we bring closure to the hurts of the past that create a very deep sense of insecurity about the future. How do we bring a closure to that? And I think this is a conversation that needs to be held across the political divide and across different sectors of society. The second conversation we need to have is how do we deepen constitutional democracy, and so that we give more than building our hopes on individuals and personalities. This, I think, will be a major investment for that conversation. Last but not least is how do we build an inclusive economy, an economy that does not depend on who you know, an economy that does not depend on patronage, an economy that does not depend on who is closest to the feeding trough, an economy that is not dependent on corruption. This conversation is a conversation we must all have. I'm glad to state that actually these conversations have begun, and they've begun at different levels. Yes, there are some conversations that are happening publicly, but there are so many serious conversations that are even happening behind the scenes. And I can say to my sister Tsitsi, yes, there is also even conversation with the different arms of the security sector. But what we need to do is to make sure that these conversations become mainstream, and that everyone starts to participate in it. And I think that's why I want to also very much respect creating platforms like these ones, because I think they allow us to find a common narrative of how such national conversations should be designed. Nations that have chosen the path of dialogue have produced outcomes that were sustainable and that produced results that the broader citizenry were satisfied with. The current aspirations that are winners take all, that work with the replacement motif, that if you replace this person with this person, things will improve. I think that is not going to produce what we all desire. Thank you very much for having me in your platform.
I think Kenneth has given us a very appropriate summary as well as a response. There's a conversation going on at different levels, and this is one of the conversations going towards the National Convention, the quest to find a solution to our country. We would hope that behind the scenes, beginning there, we can begin structuring, as you said, structuring the conversation towards a defined outcome. A defined outcome which is inclusive, which is socially based. You pointed out very correctly that all agreements in the past have been elite pacts. We need to move beyond that. I think that's one of the objectives of the National Convention, which is the process we're involved in this conversation. So I'd like to thank Timo, Justina.
Otosangana naye so mu, but with Tados.